Welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We took a couple of weeks hiatus from the weekly Bible study, and now we're back, and we're getting ready for the sixth Sunday in the season of Easter. And this week, we're actually going to deviate from the lectionary. We're going to focus on a gospel text from the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 through 14. It's one of the Sabbath controversy stories. Let me begin with the first of the three P's, prayer. And this prayer will be our opening prayer this coming Sunday, and it's kind of a meditation. God's love is our nourishment. God's truth, our liberation. God's words, our wisdom. God's peace, our home. Welcome to the love of God. Amen. That's been adapted from the UCC Worship Ways for the sixth Sunday in the season of Easter, Year C on the lectionary. The second of the three P's is perspective. And today's perspective is shaped by the recent racist mass killing in Buffalo at a Tops grocery store, which killed 10 people and injured 3 others. Since that attack on May 14th, there have been 6 more mass shootings in the U.S. The website gunviolencearchive.org tracks all gun incidents, as they call them, in the U.S., and it labels a mass shooting as an incident where 4 or more people are shot. So, since the mass shooting in Buffalo on May 14th, 5 people were shot in Amarillo, Texas, 5 more in Houston, 4 in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, 7 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 6 in Laguna Woods, California, and 4 in Palo Alto, California. Back in 2012, just days after the killing of 6 and 7-year-olds at Sandy Hook, journalist Gary Willis wrote a piece for the New York Review of Books, which talked about how the gun in the U.S. is an idol. Willis drew upon the Old Testament image of idolatry to make this point, and in particular, he called the gun in the U.S. our Moloch. Moloch was an ancient deity who demanded human sacrifice. So I want to read to you an excerpt from what Willis wrote about the gun being our Moloch. Here's what he said. Few crimes are more harshly forbidden in the Old Testament than sacrifice to the god Moloch. The sacrifice referred to was of living children consumed in the fires of offering to Moloch. Ever since then, worship of Moloch has been the sign of a deeply degraded culture. Ancient Romans justified the destruction of Carthage by noting that children were sacrificed to Moloch there. Milton represented Moloch as the first pagan god who joined Satan's war on humankind, and he wrote in Paradise Lost, "First Moloch, horrid king, besmeared with blood of human sacrifice and parents' tears." The horror of gun violence, says Willis, cannot be blamed just on one unhinged person. It's the sacrifice we as a culture make and continually make to our demonic God. We guarantee that crazed man after crazed man will have a flood of killing power readily supplied to him. We have to make that offering out of devotion to our Moloch, our God. The gun is our Moloch. We sacrifice people to him daily. The gun is not a mere tool, a bit of technology, a political issue, a point of debate. It is an object of reverence. Like most gods, it does what it will, and it cannot be questioned. Its acolytes think it is capable only of good things. It guarantees life and safety and freedom. It even guarantees law. Law grows from it. Then how can law question it? Its power to do good is matched by its incapacity to do anything wrong. It cannot kill. Thwarting the god is what kills. The answer to problems caused by guns is more guns, millions of guns, guns everywhere, carried openly, carried secretly, in bars, in churches, in offices, in government buildings. Only the lack of guns can be a curse, not their beneficent omnipresence. Adoration of Moloch permeates the country, imposing a hushed silence as he works his will. One cannot question his rights, even as the blood is gushing through the idol's teeth. The fact that the gun is a reverenced god can be seen in its manifold and apparently resistless powers. How do we worship it? Let us count the ways. Willis lists 3. First, it has the power to destroy the reasoning process. It forbids making logical connections. We are required to deny that there is any connection between the fact that we have the greatest number of guns in private hands and the greatest number of deaths from them. Reason is helpless before such abject faith. Second, it has the power to turn all our politicians as a class into invertebrate and mute attendants at the shrine. None dare suggest that Moloch can in any way be reined in. And third, it has the power to distort our constitutional thinking. It says that the right to bear arms, a military term, gives anyone, anywhere in our country the power to mow down civilians with military weapons. And here's how Willis concludes. The state itself bows down to Moloch and protects the sacrifices made to him. So let us celebrate the falling bodies as a demonstration of our fealty, our bondage to the great God gun. Now, he refers in that excerpt to the Old Testament, in particular Leviticus 18:21, which says, "You shall not give any of your offspring to sacrifice them to Moloch and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." This piece of Jewish law was meant to protect the innocent, the most vulnerable in society, from fanaticism, from making sacrifices to an idol like Moloch, because in Jewish law, it was built on 2 fundamental teachings when it came to how to treat fellow human beings. The first fundamental teaching in Jewish law is every person is created in the image of God and filled with the breath of God. And the second fundamental teaching about how to relate to fellow human beings is love your neighbor as yourself. So, if every person is precious and meant to be treated with love and compassion, then sacrificing them to a god like Moloch or to any idol that dehumanizes is considered to be abhorrent. Now, the New Testament develops these themes in the life and teachings of Jesus, which brings us to the third of the 3 P's, which is pieces of Scripture. And again, we're looking at Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 through 14. And again, we're deviating from the lectionary readings for this Sunday because I want to focus on this particular issue. So, this is Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 through 14. Jesus left that place and entered their synagogue. A man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath?" so that they might accuse him. He said to them, "Suppose one of you has only 1 sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it was restored, as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against Jesus, how to destroy him. Okay, so this is one of the so-called controversy stories in the Gospels, and frequently these controversy stories focus on interpretations of Sabbath law. The question in many of these cases, as in today's text, is whether healing on the Sabbath is a breach of the Sabbath mandate to rest from work. Is healing a form of work? Now, Sabbath law was, of course, one of the big 10 laws in the Old Testament, one of the 10 commandments. So it's taken very seriously. And because the mandate to keep the Sabbath is simply a mandate to do no work, a large body of rabbinic interpretation arose to define what was meant by work. How can you know if you're breaking Sabbath law if you're not clear about what constitutes work? Is cooking work? Is carrying something work? How far can you walk before your walking becomes working, etc., etc., etc.? However, rabbinic interpreters also made exceptions to Sabbath law. Other laws could override the mandate to rest. So, the Jewish Talmud states that, quote, danger to life annuls the Sabbath. So, one was permitted to do certain kinds of work to save a life on the Sabbath. The question is healing one of them? Now, this seems to be the way, based on the story, that Jesus interprets loopholes to Sabbath law. So, into the story, verses 9 through 14. The setting of the story is a synagogue, and it's a Sabbath day, the day of rest. We're told in verse 10 that a man with a withered hand was there. Now, that word withered means dry, and it's used to speak of things like withered plants. It's some kind of physical condition that this man is suffering from. The opponents in the story are Pharisees. And the Pharisees in verse 10 see an opportunity to trap Jesus. They point to the man and they ask Jesus whether it's lawful to heal on the Sabbath. Their question basically is healing a form of work and thus a breach of Sabbath law? And they're tempting Jesus to do this thing, to do this healing act. Now, I should pause here and give a little background on interpretations of Sabbath law in ancient Judaism. As I already mentioned, resting on the Sabbath was one of the Big Ten, one of the 10 Commandments. It also happens to be one of only 2 of the 10 Commandments that is not a thou shalt not command. So you have thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not make any graven images, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet, etc., etc. Honor thy father and thy mother, and remember the Sabbath day are 2 positive commands. They're not thou shalt not commands. So, Sabbath involves doing something and not just not doing something. It, of course, involves not working, but the mandate is to rest. It's a positive command. What does resting mean? The Pharisees in today's story were one of several groups in early Judaism. There were Sadducees, Essenes, the Qumran community, priests, etc., and there's a lot of overlap between these various groups. And several of these groups differed on what resting meant on the Sabbath. So take one group, take the Essenes, for example. They're talked about in Josephus, who was a first century Jewish historian. They were quite strict, according to Josephus. Resting on the Sabbath for them meant not even doing things like lighting a fire to cook one's food. In one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Damascus document, which may have been written by the Essenes, it even mentions that speaking about work on the Sabbath was forbidden, as was walking beyond 1,000 cubits from one's home, or food on the ground could not be picked up or water carried on the Sabbath. A beast could not be struck on the Sabbath. Servants could not carry children on the Sabbath. Animals that fall into a cistern could not be lifted out on the Sabbath. All of this would constitute work. Now, that last one in particular connects with today's story because Jesus answers the Pharisees' question about whether one can heal on the Sabbath by asking them whether they would rescue their sheep if it fell into a pit on the Sabbath. The implication is, yes, indeed, absolutely, they would rescue a sheep if it fell into a pit on the Sabbath, which means that the Pharisees had a different view of Sabbath law or Sabbath observance than did the Essenes. The Essenes, again, forbade rescuing an animal in that way. Incidentally, there's evidence in early Judaism of groups debating loopholes in Sabbath law. I'm deviating a little bit here, but it is interesting. So, you take one example from a Jewish collection of tractates called the Mishnah. And it talks about a Pharisaic tradition of fusion or interweaving of houses to permit the carrying of vessels from one house to another. The issue was that it was forbidden to carry something across an alley or a courtyard from one house to another house on the Sabbath. That kind of carrying would constitute work and thus a breach of Sabbath law. So what the interpreters did was to create a loophole. If you placed doorposts and lintels at the entrances to the alleys or the courtyards, then the entire space, with the many houses connected, the entire space could be considered then a single house. And thus you wouldn't be guilty if you carried from one house to another, because the whole thing was treated as if it were a single house, united by the courtyard or the alley. Other groups in early Judaism, like the Sadducees, disagreed with these sorts of loopholes. So back to Jesus. He points out that the Pharisees would indeed pull a sheep out of a ditch on the Sabbath. And once Jesus makes this point, he sets them up for a zinger. So in verse 12 he says, "How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." So if you were going to help a hurting animal on the Sabbath, how much more should you help a hurting human being? This is actually a standard rabbinic way of making a point. It's called Kal by Omer. So it's the light and the heavy, or the minor and the major. So you would rescue a sheep, that's the minor. How much more should you rescue a human being? That's the major. So this is sort of a mic drop moment for Jesus. How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? And then Jesus proceeds to heal the man. Now, if we read this story from the perspective of guns as idols, guns as Moloch, and in particular after this racist tragedy in Buffalo last week, I think we see a principle emerge from the teaching and life of Jesus. So Jesus, as a rabbi, could absolutely debate interpretations of Sabbath law with other religious authorities. We, in our day, can absolutely debate interpretations of the Second Amendment right to bear arms. But all interpretations for Jesus pale in comparison to a fundamental principle, which is a human being is more valuable than ideas about the Sabbath or ideas about particular laws or ideas about the Second Amendment. A human being's safety is more valuable than ideas about gun ownership. Black human beings' safety in a grocery store is more valuable and precious than racist ideas about white people being replaced in this country, which is what the shooter in Buffalo believed, and many other shooters like him have believed. So I can almost hear Jesus pleading with us today. Isn't a human being worth more than a gun? Isn't a human being worth more than your racist ideas about white replacement? Isn't a human being worth more than your idolatrous worship of bloodthirsty Moloch? For Jesus, as a faithful Jew, showing compassion to human beings always took precedence over ideas. He was a faithful Jew who believed and also demonstrated in his ministry and in his life, first, that every human being is created in the image of God and therefore worthy of reverence and is precious. And second, loving your neighbor as yourself is the highest calling of people of faith.